I was wondering, Tilda, if we're going to be able to see Derek in the U.S. I mean, has there been?
Have you not seen it here yet?
No, have we? It hasn't been released here, has it?
I must admit, I'm behind the loop on when it's being or if it's being released.
Does anyone know? Do you know, Eugene?
MoMA showed it for like a week, I think.
MoMA showed it
did,
for a week?
But that's
oh,
about
God.
Yeah.
It's a documentary about Derek Jarman, directed by Isaac Julian. You did narration and wrote. You wrote and did narration. So you were in on it from the beginning, or was he starting to edit?
Well, no. The original kind of pretext of the film was that I was asked in something like 2003 to write and deliver a thing at the Edinburgh Film Festival called the Derek Jarman Memorial Lecture, which I did, which was quite widely published. And the thing that was quite striking to us all then was the response was quite overwhelmingly about, oh yes, Derek Jarman, why has he sort of been forgotten? Why are there now two generations of film students and young people who've never heard of him? Why are the DVDs of his films so impossible to find, etc.? So that sort of galvanized all Derek's collaborators and family to think about how we might, what's the American word, memorialize? But how we need, to educate people about
and reintroduce.
And we had the wonderful, magical opportunity to literally reintroduce him to people, because with 2 years before he died, Derek died of AIDS in 1994, but 2 years before was very, very ill and very nearly died. And when he rallied, he and Colin McCabe had the foresight to do a really long, extensive interview, which lasted for about 9 hours, about everything he wanted to say about everything. And so this was the kernel of our film. That's the thing. That's why it's really worth seeing. It's not just a documentary about him. It is actually him speaking.
He was, when I became conscious of filmmaking as something I could be part of, I was, my parents were living in Berlin, and my father was the military commander of Berlin and lived in a giant mansion paid for by the German government. And I would come visit and sneak away to the film festival. And in '88 I went to see The Last of England and saw him speaking, and I don't know, I didn't know him that well. I only saw him live, once at a panel at Sundance and once there, and I met him, and I mean, it's just, maybe it sounds a bit cliche, but I felt kind of a saint-like thing. I felt a generosity and a kindness of which you don't you don't always want to meet the people that you're impressed by, because you can be very easily disillusioned and crushed. And I have to say that the same year I also met Samuel Beckett, and I felt the same thing. The year before he died, and I remember he was at a panel at Sundance, 91 or 92, which was like the first kind of queer panel there, and he was just so happy. He hardly said a word, but he just, let Todd Haynes and Christine Vachon and Tom Kalin all just talk, and he was just kind of laughing their whole thing. He was like, finally, I can be a godfather. And there's a direct line from him to Todd and Tom and Chris Munch and all kinds of people, Gus Van Sant, who whose way of working inspired me too. Watching their way of working really inspired me. It was absolutely pure, and there was really no question of it being pure. It was never self-consciously pure, it seemed to me. It was just, we're doing our thing now. And I wonder, I haven't seen the documentary, I wonder how you met.
I met Derek in a strangely orthodox way. He was putting together a film called Caravaggio in 1985, and we had friends in common who kept saying to each other that we would like each other, but actually I went along to see if he wanted me to be in his film, and we just met and never stopped talking, really. He was an extraordinary person in that he was genuinely inspiring. He was, and again, I urge you to seek out the film, because I mean, to seek out his films and his work, his writing, but also to see him, because for those of us who knew him, we all know that however interesting his films were, however interesting his work as a political, cultural activist, however interesting his writing was, however interesting his paintings were, the most interesting thing about Derek was him. I mean, that was just all just evidence, and he was really quite something, incredibly charismatic, and great fun to be around, and also, I mean, what he represented for me, I mean, I literally couldn't even begin to tell you what he represented for me, except I could say that I really don't believe that I would be performing in films if I hadn't met him, because what he provided me personally with was this sort of lab atmosphere in which I could play out or just work out how it could be that who, when I first met him, I had left university, I was a writer, who should have gone to art school, who went to university, stopped writing, wanted to find film, couldn't find film, worked in the theatre, was alienated by the theatre. I was completely what they would call beat and high and dry. And when I met Derek Jarman, he gave me this place to go to, because I knew that I didn't want to be a proper actor. I knew I didn't want to work in the theatre or television or industrial cinema. And you see, the thing about Derek also is that he was, for our generation, he was the representative of a time. He was like a contact with the 60s and the 70s for us, into the 80s and 90s. So he was, that way of living, that way of sharing, that way of making work together. Because as a fine artist, as a painter, he knew what it was to work alone. He made films in order to have company. It was about throwing a party and being in conversation with people. That's why he made cinema.
And he slipped right into that punk rock ethos out of something that was different. You know, it was what I felt. It was much more generous than, I mean, in some ways you could say he was Warhol. He had his own group of people and was creating his counter film culture, but with Warhol you didn't feel a lot of warmth often. You saw brilliance at times, but you didn't always feel the great compassion that he had for his characters. And I remember seeing Caravaggio in college, and it was pretty amazing for also being coming out in all the same year that it came out, as being gay, and thinking I don't really belong in this any kind of queer culture or gay culture that I had seen, and then I saw that. And
well, I think the way in which he was so interested in and was so much fun was really radical, particularly at that time. And the fact that, especially when things got really grim, and people started getting really ill, and people started getting really angry, and people started getting really sad, he was all of those things, but he was also always fun, even when he died. And it really was amazing when he came out in 1989. When it came out, I should say, he came out as being HIV positive.
I think it was even 88, possibly, or maybe I saw him, but I remember being aware of that and being.
Well, the last.
He was
of
the first
England,
person I knew that was.
The last of England was that was the moment when he.
That's when it
came
happened,
out.
right?
So.
And
it was at a time. It's hard to really remember this, but it was at a time, and people were talking, certainly in the United Kingdom, people were actually talking about making segregated HIV communities on islands, and people were not only terrified of losing their lives and their friends, but also their jobs and their insurance and all these ridiculous things that people were worrying about at the time. They were actually thinking that people needed to be declassified in some way.
Did he
even
get barred
in those
from the
mad.
US? Was he barred from the US because of those laws?
I don't think he ever was. I don't think, but there was always this possibility that anything might happen. To be honest, it really was a weird time.
He died right before the drugs.
he died right, like so many thousands of people. He died right before the drugs, but not without making his life and his illness and his dialogue with his illness absolutely transparent and
Useful.
available and useful and critical and to everybody. And that generosity was really amazing. And he made films right up until he died. His last film was a film called Blue, when he was losing his sight, which was just a blue screen and a soundtrack. We actually developed it as a series of concerts, and eventually it was made into a film. And there is a film which is called his last film, which in fact he was barely conscious for the edit of, which is a film called Glitterbug, which was just his Super 8, which is edited together.
And that's just come out on DVD.
There's an exhibition of his Super 8s at the Dia building now.
Right now, at the Dia Center for the Arts
Yeah,
in Chelsea.
I think it's on for a month or so.